Maurizio, you grew up in an Italian household. We'll start kind of right from the beginning. So, of course, that means plenty of pizza, pasta, incredible sauces and foods. But what made you fall in love with cooking in the first place?
I think, that definitely goes into it. I think also the fact that my dad had a restaurant here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So he started that, 40 years ago when he came over from Italy, actually. And I grew up in the back of that restaurant while he was making pizza and, making all the food for the customers that came in. So I was always around, food and pizza. And I think, that for sure played a big impact on kind of giving me this seed, I think, this interest in cooking and baking. So I think those two things. And, for whatever reason, I've always just been like a foodie person. I've just really been into having good quality food and healthy food, and all those things kind of played into leading me to kind of become a baker eventually.
Why Albuquerque in the first place for your dad?
It's a good question. It's kind of a long story, but my mom is from the U.S. and she went to Italy and she met my dad, and I think they were passing. Let's see, my aunt lived here, so my mom came back with my dad. I mean, they got married after having known each other just a few months, kind of deal. Came back to the U.S. and then they just settled here. And I actually think, it's a great city. There's something to be said for sunny every day, pretty much, which is amazing.
Sunny and dry, right?
Sunny and dry. And I think it was actually kind of conducive for starting a restaurant because there weren't a lot of Italian restaurants here.
Sure.
And I think it was the perfect kind of bed for my dad to kind of grow this restaurant business.
That does. That makes a lot of sense. What were your first experiences that you remember cooking?
I remember like my Italian grandmother being here with us, she would come for like months at a time, and she would always have us like in the kitchen, rolling pasta. And I can remember her like, yelling at us like, you got to roll it faster, things in Italian, of course, things like that. And, while it was stressful rolling out pasta under the gaze of she was a professional chef. So it was, there was stress.
Yes.
But it was still fun. And as a kid, I think those kind of things. And I do the same thing for my kids now. I'm not yelling at them in Italian, but I'm trying to give them, encouragement to bake and cook in the kitchen. So definitely, those early days. And my mom and my dad were always cooking at home too. And I think I can't say what the first thing I cooked was, but I can say my first word as a baby was hot. And my parents will never let me forget that because I was in the kitchen with them and, I touched the stove kind of deal. So
I think that happens to a lot of people, but specifically ones that are growing up in the kitchen like you were. So everything seems to be moving towards a career in the culinary arts, whether being a chef or a pastry chef or just anything that deals with food. But it's not necessarily the way you went, right? You're a software engineer by trade.
That's right. I went in the complete opposite direction than the food industry. I'm not sure exactly the moment when I decided, like, do I want to become a chef? Do I want to become a baker? I don't know what drove me into it, but when I was younger in high school, it was kind of the time when computers were like really, they'd been around, of course, but like personal computers are really becoming more available for the everyday person. And I just remember I took a class in high school, and my teacher let us use the computer, after class. And I was just taken with just everything about it. Like, and it wasn't just the software part, the internet and that kind of thing. It was like the actual hardware. And I always grew up as a kid, I'm one of those kids who, took everything apart. I took apart the clocks. I took apart the VCR player, all that stuff. And I think I've always just had kind of an engineering, mindset.
Does that come anywhere from your family at all? Or is that just kind of something that was innate?
I like to think that, a chef or even a baker has kind of that innate ability or this interest in like deconstructing things and rebuilding them. But I also have to say that my grandfather, on my mom's side, he was very much kind of interested in technology, and back then it was like cameras for him and turntables and those kind of things. And being around him a little bit as a kid, I think that kind of wore off on me a little bit. But I think some of it comes from his side as well.
Now, it's interesting that you say that, because I was kind of thinking about it as well. You can just tell on your website, The Perfect Loaf, and through your cookbook, you have a scientific mind, and that is something that you bring to this type of endeavor where, baking is very much scientific. It's formulaic, it's precise. You do one thing wrong, your bread doesn't rise. Been through it, especially at the beginning. I'm a pretty avid sourdough baker myself, so actually just made a couple of loaves this morning. And do you feel like that's what kind of drew you to baking maybe in the first place, is the fact that you get the opportunity to use this type of skill set?
Absolutely. I love the precision, when it comes to measurements and timetables, and kind of, it's really, baking is kind of like this algorithmic thing that you're doing, just like, the software I write. It's a set of steps that you're doing. And in many ways, iterative software development is the same with baking. You're working on something over and over and over again, maybe making like tiny little changes here and there to get a better result. So I think, I've heard from a lot of other engineers who write in and they're like, I'm an engineer too, and I'm a baker too. And I'm just like, there's something about it. I think it really, compared to something like cooking, where I would consider myself I cook a lot, but I'm very much a novice cook. And I think it comes down to the fact that, just like my dad and my grandmother, they're more like, handful of salt, the dough needs to feel this way or whatever. And, with baking, it's very much tactile too. And you got to use all your senses, but I think there's the component of like measurement and iteration that really kind of drew me in.
Yeah, baker's percentages and all that stuff, which obviously
exactly
makes a big difference. You put too much salt in. I guess it's the same thing with cooking. But if you put too much salt in at the beginning of a bread baking experience, you're done. Like you don't have right. a chance, right? You can't just go back or add water, or it doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah, you've got to get everything kind of nailed down from the get-go. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, you certainly do. Do you remember your first experience or your first experiences with sourdough, or when you kind of really started to jump into it?
Yeah, so I was working at home, so I had left my job at kind of the corporate world, and I started with some coworkers a small app development business. And during that time, I was working at home for all day, every day, no coworker interaction kind of deal. And I wanted to kind of get my hands in, work with something, tangible instead of just typing away on a keyboard. And I was given a gift, a sourdough cookbook, actually, back then. There weren't a lot. There weren't many of them. It was the Tartine cookbook.
I had a feeling, yeah.
Yeah. That
kind
that
of the sourdough Bible, right?
Exactly. And it was, huge inspiration for me. And, there was something great about being home and, writing some software, kind of going into the kitchen, folding the dough, turning the dough. So I was around and I could kind of do that sort of thing. And after reading the Tartine book and being exposed to sourdough fermentation, specifically, the science behind all that, I think captivated me in a way that I had never really been exposed to before. Because even at my dad's restaurant, everything was commercial yeast and instant yeast then. I didn't have this understanding or appreciation for fermentation and kind of naturally harnessing, bacteria and yeasts and those kind of things. So it was a combination of all those things. And when I dove in with, creating my sourdough starter, I was like that was it. I loved it. I couldn't get enough, and it just kept getting worse and worse, if you will.
I think that's incredible, because it's kind of it's a similar story with me. I'm a, sports broadcaster that does work from home and kind of can make his own schedule in some ways, doing play-by-play and, prepping for games and that sort of thing. And it fills in the time, but it also kind of gives you a sense of purpose, doesn't it? And when you're able to take something out of the combo cooker that looks incredible and it's going to taste good, but when it looks good and everything has been fulfilled that you've been trying to accomplish, it gives you a pretty good feeling, doesn't it?
It's an incredible sense of satisfaction. It's like, you have this inert flour and some water in your sourdough starter and some salt, and it's like, what other thing can you create kind of magically in a way that comes out like bread? I mean, it really is like just a crazy, amazing process, and it does give you a super deep sense of gratification.
So was it all based on the tartine book at first, like your first recipes, who you were trying to emulate when you started in this space?
Yeah, it started with the tartine recipes, and then I kind of branched out. There was like Ken Forkish's book is really great. I had bought Bread by Jeffrey Hamelman, which was, it's kind of like another Bible there.
Yep.
And, there was some information online. There wasn't a lot, but there was a few things here and there. And, well, that's one reason why I decided to start my website, because
This was when, like early 2010s or before that?
Let's see, I started my site like at the very end of 2012, 2013. Yep. So it was like, it was like 2010 or 2011, around there. Yeah.
So you try to emulate what's in tartine and these other cookbooks. When do you feel like you got a handle on it? Or you were like, hey, I think I really understand this, and maybe I can start to do my own thing in some ways?
It took many years, I think. I think there was a lot of, just blindly following recipe kind of thing. But I'd say, early on, maybe after the first 6 months or year or so, I started, as I always do, I started kind of tinkering with changing, variables like, salt, and started to like play around with and see what effect changing certain things had. And that's one of the reasons why I have always been so interested in it, is that there's just an endless playground of like changing variables and, temperature changes and starter maintenance changes. But yeah, it took me a little while before I kind of felt like I had a grasp enough to kind of change around and play with the variables.
What was the beginning of the website? Like, what did it look like at first?
It was very basic. It was very like kind of stock website. I've always been exposed to building stuff on the web because I've been, interested in computers for so long. But I never created a site like, the Perfect Loaf. I never made a food site. And I never made any site where I published consistent content on. It was pretty basic, and I didn't have really an understanding even back then of things like WordPress or, a lot of the CMS tools that are out there. So I just, I picked it up and I did a little bit of my own development behind the scenes and expanded it. And over the years, I've just continued to improve it and make it more user-friendly, and, of course, publish more and more baking material.
Did you have a bunch of recipes before you had started it, or kind of just begin with your, beginner sourdough recipe and go from there? How did it work?
Yeah, it just evolved with whatever I was literally working on in the kitchen. So I would, hey, I'm going to try, my early posts are kind of like, hey, I'm going to try this, let's see how it turns out. And then I wrote about it. And I think that resonated with people because it was that sense of like experimentation and kind of seeing behind the recipe. And I think that's what people really enjoy about my website.
What was it like for you at first? I mean, how many bad loaves did you create? How many bad recipes did you go through?
I mean, there were some challenging times at the beginning. I always say, the first loaf I made actually was pretty good. Like all things considered, it was a new sourdough starter. I had no concept of like temperature or, a lot of the main variables. And it was totally edible. It was really sour, and it was a little bit under risen. Like there was just not enough. I basically proofed it for too long. But it's easy to do amazing.
That at first.
Yeah.
I feel like it's easier to overproof than it is underproof at first. You're just like, I don't know if it's ready. And then it just goes way too long. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, it was like transformational for me in a way that, few hobbies or side ventures that people go into, I think, it's like, okay, I want to learn to play golf. Like golf is a great sport, but for some reason, like bread baking, like it just hooked me when I pulled that first loaf of bread out of there.
I think it's easier to be good at bread baking than it is to be good at golf, and maybe that's
true.
It's easier to like produce. I don't think there's a perfect loaf. Like I think you say in your about me on the page, you have a quote that we're all looking for the perfect loaf, but why do we want to get there? Because then where do you go from there, right? And you've kind of just been, I think, emulating that in some ways, trying to find out what the best recipe is and then perfect it from there.
Yeah, and I say that in my cookbook too. It's, there really is no perfect loaf. Like it's really about that kind of constant iteration and the work towards that kind of ideal that I think that's what keeps, I would say, most bakers going, because that even the smallest changes can have, profound impact on the end loaf. And it really requires like all of your senses and, all of your observational skills and everything to kind of just hone the process and get better every single bake.
Yeah, it very much takes feel, and I think that there's nothing that you can do for that other than do it. And
just do it.
It takes time, right? It takes time to figure out what a loaf is supposed to look like. Like the first one I remember, it's supposed to bulk ferment for 4 hours. And I look at it and it's like 4 hours. And I was like, I don't know if this is ready yet. And I did it. And I don't know if it was ready at the time. So, sometimes it based on what's going on outside and what the dough temperature is like, what the outside temperature is like in the room, what your starter is like that day. It's very much a feel thing, and I don't know if people understand how much that factors into the final product of sourdough.
It's huge, and I try to write a lot about that because I think some people are used to following like a cooking recipe, to the letter, and with baking, I'm always like, okay, stop for a second, take a look at what's going on, assess it, and change if you need to change what's happening, because, like you said, things are changing in the kitchen, and you need to adjust.
So when you started Perfect Loaf, how did you first begin to grow the website and gain the following? Not that you have now, obviously, but what it was at first.
It was very slow going. I mean, I was just writing almost for myself for the first, X years. I mean, it took a long while. It's one of those things where I was doing, I was writing on the website and I was baking and doing all these things because it's truly a passion and an interest for me. There really was never a plan for me to like, okay, I'm going to turn this into a business and write a cookbook. I mean, none of that was even in my head, or there was no concept of it.
But you know what, Maurizio, that's why you're successful, right? I mean, that is why, because you love it and that passion comes through, and you were never looking to make $1 million or make a New York Times best-selling cookbook, which congratulations, by the way, which is awesome. That just came out. But, you were in it for yourself, and people understand that, and I think they gravitate towards it when someone that is doing something and trying to launch something loves it as much as it seems like they do as well.
I agree. I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but like looking back, I think, if I wasn't as interested in the topic as I am, then I think I would have probably stopped posting or burned out or whatever. But I mean, it's literally been 10 years, and I think I've posted at least one time a month for the past, 10 years. So it's been, it's just been a labor of love. And I think the people that visit the site and, leave a comment and write emails, they cherish hearing from somebody who's real, and, it's actually me writing emails and replying and helping. And I think it's kind of rare these days to make a connection over the internet or whatever, so it's something I've loved doing this whole time.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, has that always been incredibly important? Because, I mean, you'll respond, people will comment on your recipes on the Perfect Loaf, and you'll provide them like unique, thoughtful advice. They'll say, I want to leave this to retard in the refrigerator for another 12 hours. Do you think that will work? Or I want to use honey instead of sugar. Those types of things, or add-ons, and you give them tailored advice. How important is that?
I think, from like my perspective, I see it as somebody kind of like, visiting my bakery in a way and asking a question. It's like, they've spent the time to try my recipe or want to try my recipe. They have a question, and a lot of times people don't have anybody to turn to, especially with baking. Yeah. So I try to be that person who's there helping. Sometimes it takes me a little while to get back to the comments, but I try to reply to every comment because it's, I think it's just important. It's important to me to provide the help to somebody else who, if it were me back, 10 years ago and I was asking someone, I would have loved it if somebody would have kind of given me a little mentorship.
Could have maybe taken a few years off of the experimentation phase, right?
Exactly.
So when you create this and get it to the following that it is now, it's obviously not a perfect road. There are going to be bumps along the way. What were some of the biggest ones that you had to deal with that you remember?
I mean, there were a lot of technical things that, popped up over the years, like, when the pandemic hit, for one, which, obviously wasn't that long ago, I started to get so much traffic to the site that it was like, it was almost stressing my host and that kind of thing. So I had to deal with those issues, but
good problems to have, though, right?
They're good problems. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there were plenty of times when, I was getting busy with, something else, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can keep up with the site for the next, 3 months, but I made it work. I made it happen. And it was such a passion and an interest that I always kind of returned back to it. But I wouldn't say I had any, there weren't any like major issues that could have like threatened the site or anything that came up. It wasn't smooth sailing by any means, but it's been something I work on.
When you get to the point now where you are and you have the opportunity to impact so many different people, is it difficult because you still have your full-time job, right? Like, this isn't a full-time gig for you, even though I'm sure you're spending a lot of time on your site, and now, of course, with the cookbook, which took up a lot of time. Is it difficult to manage that and kids and a dog and, I mean, just trying to do everything at once? It's not easy.
It's a lot of work. I think running a food website, it takes a very serious commitment. I think if you're going to make it, like, try to make it work. And I think specifically with sourdough bread baking, it's hard because the timelines are, 2-3 days for one recipe. So
I've managed and rearranged my life many, many times based on what the process of bulk fermentation and what the hours are like. Trust me. Sometimes can't go to dinner. I need to shape. I'm sorry. Because if I don't shape, you don't get bread.
Exactly.
I say that to my fiance sometimes.
You might lose friends because you can't go out with them, but then you give them the bread and it kind of smooths things over.
All is well.
Yeah, I think I think it takes a commitment. It takes a serious commitment to keep it up, and especially like replying to comments and emails and things like that. I mean, they're all good problems to have in a way. And if it's something that's important to you, and like bread baking, it has always been kind of my main hobby, for the past 10 years or so. And I think these days my day job, my main job, has shifted more towards, the Perfect Loaf than it has, my software engineering career. And, I still love both sides of things. I still love engineering. I still love writing software, but there's always bread calling. So it's like, where do I go?
It's not just bread. It's pizza, it's focaccia, it's bagels, True. It's pretzels. It's
right. It's a lot of things.
And not just a loaf. So what we like to do here on Creative License is really dive into a creative process. And in this case, for you, it's developing a recipe. So can you walk me through kind of how you do that? Let's start with the idea and just kind of go from there.
Yeah. It depends. It depends on where I'm kind of getting inspiration from. So, sometimes maybe I'm seeing an inspiring baker on Instagram, or somebody wrote me about something and they're asking about a certain kind of bread. There's so many different kind of cultural breads that I think are extremely fascinating. So I've only really scratched the surface there, especially with Italian baking. There's so many areas for me to dig into in the future. I can't wait to do that. But I usually start with, something that has kind of come up and that has inspired me, whether it's somebody I've seen, or even with my kids. I'm trying to think of healthy breads to make them while they're young, sandwich loaves, things that they like that are soft but not, full of sugar kind of deal. And
I like that on your recipes too. At the very beginning, you kind of give that description, whether it's a family memory of focaccia, or, like you said, like a bread that will be healthy for your kids' sandwiches, or something that would be great for toast, like a pan de mie or something. Yeah, that it totally makes sense. That's probably my favorite part of the website, is seeing those little descriptions apart from the recipes, obviously.
I love that. Yeah. Sometimes I feel like people just skip down to the recipe, but people have actually wrote in and they've been like, I never really paid attention too much to your, kind of head notes. But I realize now that they actually like set the stage for the recipe and, leave some tips and things.
Yep.
And that's what I try to do. I try not to be too verbose and, that kind of thing, but I want to give people context for why I developed a recipe. And sometimes, the recipes are, they're challenging in not having much, professional bakery training. I have to go through, X number of trials before I got it, exactly where I want it. And I think that's another one of the strengths of my site and my recipes is that, everything that goes out is like meticulously tested and vetted here kind of in my kitchen. So
you get a recipe that you like, and that sometimes takes a little while, I would imagine. Where do you go from there? Is it tinkering with different ingredients as well? Or you kind of know the ingredients that you want to put in at the very beginning?
I'll start out with an idea, so like a concept for what I want to have in the bread, or
let's do a real example. Give me one of your recipes and kind of take me through that process of how you created it.
We can talk about sourdough bagels. So those are everybody loves bagels, and they're a hard thing to make because I think everybody has a different idea for what a good bagel is, depending on maybe where they grew up or what they've had most. Being here in New Mexico, we don't have like New York style bagels. We don't have like Montreal style bagels. We've got some kind of weird mix of bagel. There's a green chili bagel out here.
Oh, that's cool though.
It's really good. It's really good. But with that recipe, usually bagels are, commercially yeasted or instant yeasted. So there's always the adaptation to natural leavening that I have to make. And the challenge there is that, some of these baked goods were designed with instant yeast. So I have to make kind of changes to the formula and the structure to get the end result that's kind of similar to what that might be. Was
there a sourdough bagel recipe that you found originally, or is this all coming through your head trying to replace yeast with natural leavening?
Yeah, it was all just trial and error. Talking with a couple other bakers. There's a few bakers up in the Pacific Northwest that I would chat about, with bagels. And, I always kind of refer to Hammelman's recipes in bread, even though his are, instant yeasted. They he bakes everything, everything is his recipes are just like foolproof basically. So everything there is kind of like gospel, anything that's in there is going to work. Yep. And you can use that as kind of a baseline. But with that recipe, I tested using, rye flour in the bagel, type 85 flour, whole wheat. So I like to take what might be out there and kind of change it up a little bit and see if I can put kind of my spin on it, but not so much that it offends anybody with, you know what I mean? Like I'm not going to do
the purists.
I'm not going to put like cheese, thread through the bagel or, anything, super crazy.
What's the key to a good bagel that you've found? A good sourdough bagel?
I think the key really is a good strong flour. Like you need a high protein flour. I think a little bit of sugar in the dough is good for sourdough leavening because it's not for sweetness. It's more for the texture that you get, when you add sugar. And then, it comes down to just managing fermentation and making sure that, the dough is fermented enough, but not too much. And I like to spread that recipe over 2 days because I think that cold fermentation time brings a little bit more kind of unexpected but welcome flavor to the bagels.
How many tries did it take you to get that sourdough bagel formula right?
That one was tough. I can't say how many tries, but it took a lot because it's in my cookbook, but it's also on my website, and I spent a lot of time developing. I did, and with bagels, you've got that extra step of boiling the dough too before you bake it, so you've got some more variables there to play with. So there's just a lot going on in that recipe, and it seems like a simple baked good that shouldn't be as hard as it is, but it's like its own. You could have your own book on just making bagels.
I'm going to be the baking cynic for a second and say bagels are great with yeast. Why do you possibly need to make them the sourdough way, right? What is your... I mean, you can make a lot of bread that way, for sure. Some you can't, but I think a lot you can. So what do you say to the people that are like, why are you going through all this, man? This just seems like like it's too much.
Yeah, and I think, using instant yeast, using commercial yeast is totally fine. Like, I'm not against it. It's not, I've been in classes where we used it for baguettes and, classic breads that were designed with instant yeast, in mind. And I'm totally fine with it. For me, it's just that I really only ever baked with sourdough, and it's, my process and my style of baking. I'm not against commercial yeast. And I think having a yeasted bagel is a great thing. Like, I've had amazing bagels in New York and, all over the place, and I'm totally cool with it. So I think using sourdough, I think it does bring more flavor to the bagel. I think there's, I try to balance the acidity and the sourness so that it's not something that's super upfront and super apparent, because that's really not the point of bagels. So I think that's also part of the challenge of kind of converting something over to natural leavening, is you have to keep that kind of thing in mind, and not in other words, it's not me using sourdough because I'm stubborn about it and I think it's the best thing in the world. It's just, that's my baking and my style of baking, and I love it, and I'm still totally cool with getting an instant yeasted bagel too.
And you can make sweeter types of bread with sourdough too. I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah, it's you hear the word sourdough and you're thinking, oh, I don't want a vodka that's sour, and or donuts or those kind of things. And if you think about it, like, commercial yeast is a pretty recent invention, really. So what did bakers do before we had packets of yeast? Well, they used natural leavening or some other type of leavening. And I think my opinion is that anything that you make with instant yeast, you can do with sourdough if you manage things right. I think the best example is panettone, which is traditionally a naturally leavened baked good from Italy, and that's kind of like the extreme end of using natural fermentation to make something incredible, and it's also extremely challenging. So yeah.
Is that the toughest thing? Like, what's the toughest conversion that you've done?
Well, there's no converting panettone because it's sourdough, and it's hard. I think a lot of bakers consider it to be kind of like the pinnacle of baking, and I agree. I think you're really pushing the envelope on every part of the process and what a dough can really handle. There's so much egg and sugar, not so much sugar, but a lot of egg. And, the dough is just pushed to the limit.
So what are some of the most difficult recipes that you had come up with that maybe took the longest time, or were the most difficult to just to be able to, I guess, not only convert, but also just to devise?
The bagel, was surely one. My shokupan, so like my, Japanese milk bread, that took a long while. I think there's still room to take my recipe there further even. So those were definitely challenges. I also think my bomboloni recipe, so that's like an Italian donut. Those are enriched with, egg and butter, and those are extremely challenging. They take a long time with, natural leavening, a long fermentation time, and they also took me a lot of time in development. In my cookbook, I have an updated recipe for that one. And, I don't remember when I first published that recipe, but since then I've kind of improved the recipe to have even like less sourness and just an even lighter donut. And it just goes back to what I said in the beginning, that like all of these things are iterative, and there's always kind of room for improvement. So those are some examples, but there's plenty of hearth style, like larger loaves that I've been working on for years. And I think like a miche, like a French miche, the large, single loaf, those are loaves that you I see them as like something you grow with like over time. And it's just something you're always playing with, you're always improving, and they just seem to keep getting better the more that you kind of work on them.
And you have a pretty big oven now, don't you?
I have a larger oven. I have a Rofco that I use. It's in my garage, actually, in my
Wow.
baking studio. I got that, 3 years ago, and I'm glad I did, because I've done some baking for some events here in town. And it's handy because it's sealed, so the steam in the oven is It's just trapped inside there. It's a little easier. I still use my home oven for testing all the recipes on my site, but I have that one if I need to do a larger bake.
That makes sense because people aren't going to have the Rothko to
exactly
be able to have in their baking studio. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, would you ever open up a bakery? I'm sure plenty of people have asked you that, but is it anything that makes you interested?
I actually went down that path 4 or 5 years ago, and I tried to get my home certified to get to bake at home. And here in Albuquerque, you actually can't bake or cook from home and then sell the products. So there's no cottage food law. There's none of that.
Okay.
So it was very difficult. I live a little bit outside the city, so I could technically get my kitchen certified. But when I started going down the path for that, it's a super long and complicated process. And, having just had 2 kids, it's like, I couldn't fit it in with, you have to like convert your kitchen over to like a production facility, in other words, when you're baking, the bread. So I couldn't do it. I'm hoping to do it at some point in the future because I think the challenge, I grew up in the food industry, at my dad's restaurant. So I know the challenges in, starting I definitely wouldn't start a restaurant, but starting a food establishment. And lots of respect to everybody who does that because it's like next level, commitment. So I'm not quite ready for that yet.
Would you ever explore like a commercial space and not do your kitchen?
Yeah, that's what I would do instead. If I was going to go down that path, and I'm hoping to at some point here, once my kids get a little bit older and I have a little bit more free time, that's the hope.
Yeah.
Then I think a commercial space is the way to go.
That could be the retirement gig at some point. I want to jump into your latest venture though, because this kind of perfectly segues into it, which is your cookbook. Name of it is The Perfect Loaf. It just came out in early November. I actually bought a copy for my brother on his birthday because he's the one who introduced me to sourdough originally. Oh. Get it. It's available everywhere. It is exceptional, and I can't wait to dive into all of the recipes. But when did you start the idea of thinking about a cookbook? Because you went from this little site with some recipes to obviously gaining some notoriety, but it's a whole different thing to get a book deal and to produce that and to have it as well received as it is right now.
Yeah, well, thank you first off. It was a lot more work than I anticipated. It was 3 years ago when I first started talking with my publisher. So before 2019, I have had a few offers from publishers come in, with, just to talk about a book deal and kind of thing. And I kind of politely declined because I really wasn't ready for the commitment, and I wasn't sure that I was ready for something that large of scale. You know what I mean? It's like taking on another job. It's like you sign up for another job.
Are these all unsolicited, by the way, just based on looking at your website and thinking, hey, this guy might have what it takes to put out a cookbook like that?
Yeah, I didn't reach out to any of them. They just, I was
awesome.
Fortunate enough that and my publisher, Clarkson Potter, they reached out to me, and they kind of had the same vision that I had for the cookbook. Like I wanted it to be, this book that kind of addressed bakers at every level and kind of like it grows with you in the kitchen. And I think the reason why I liked them, besides the fact that they've published some of my favorite cookbooks, like books by Alice Waters and so many other cookbooks, they were on board with that vision. And I think a lot of the publishers, wanted like more of a beginner's book, and mine definitely is, but it has recipes that will suit you at whatever level of baking you're at. And I wrote it that way to kind of evolve with you in the kitchen. And so, in 2019, they reached out and we started talking, and I just was kind of impressed with what idea they had and the timeline. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and kind of threw things into a whirlwind. I mean, the book was supposed to be out, I think, last fall. So it was basically a year late. But that's how it started. And I don't know if I could have asked for a better publisher because they've just been amazing to work with.
Tell me about the commitment level that it took. I can't even imagine trying to not only just run your website, but also get things ready to go for this cookbook. Because it's not a small book. There's a lot of recipes in there.
We basically, the book is as long and as large as it could be, is basically what they told me. They were like, this is maximum. I mean, we cut a lot of words too. So, I wanted it to be a kind of all encompassing. So I think, I don't know. There was a lot that went into it, a lot of kind of research and development and kind of, just baking and testing. And my editor was amazing. She kind of went through the manuscript, I don't know how many times, and we, just went back and forth. But because of the pandemic, we got delayed because I was here writing. And I've always continued to publish on my website. Like I said, every month for the past 10 years. So I always have, something going there. And then my kids were homeschooled because of the pandemic. So I was, my wife and I were doing that. It basically meant getting up at 4 a.m., writing for 2 hours. Yeah. And it was, and then I would test and then I would bake at night, around the kids' schedule kind of thing. It was brutal. Yeah. It was a huge undertaking.
I love the way you write, but that's not your background, too. Did you always have that ability to kind of, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the correct term or the best way to describe your writing, but it just it takes you back. It's really beautiful. Is that something you always kind of had and you knew that you would be able to utilize, or did you work on your writing style throughout as well?
Thank you. I actually take a lot of pride in the words that I put. And I think nowadays
I think the best way to describe it is it produces a sort of feeling, but it doesn't feel corny.
Right.
You don't look at it, and even though you're talking about summers growing up, visiting your family in Italy, you're not like, geez, what is this guy doing? This is horrible. You're just like, wow, that's kind of nice.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm going for, because I think I'm really sensitive to that kind of overly sensitive, corny writing too. So I'm always checking myself there. But I've always loved, even though I'm an engineer and I'm on the math side of things and that kind of stuff, I've always loved writing throughout school. And I can remember in elementary school, and I didn't remember this memory didn't come back to me until I was writing the book, and I was like, I remember there was an assignment where we had to write a book, and I think the book was or not a book, sorry. We had to write an essay on your family pets kind of thing. And I showed up to class and I turned in a 20-page little booklet on my pets. And I can remember my teacher saying oh, this kid's going to be a writer one day, I don't know, maybe that sat with me somewhere, and I never, didn't unearth it until I was actually in the process. But I take a lot of pride in spending time and writing and kind of crafting this narrative around the recipes. And I think because I'm so passionate about bread and, cooking and food and baking, it's easy for me to pull up those kind of feelings as I'm writing. And my whole goal is that, with those little head notes and the little paragraphs that I write here and there, is I want people to have what you described, a feeling, because I think food, not only are there, food memories locked up in the food that you're eating, but it's it goes so much more beyond just the act of eating something. It's it brings you back somewhere, or, maybe you're making new memories with the food. And that's part of the joy to me. And I certainly learned a lot through the book writing process, because having a professional editor look at your writing and kind of, just hone things in and, erase the kind of extraneous stuff that you don't need, and just the grammatical improvements. I think over the past 3 years, my writing is really taken to the next level.
So you feel like you can take that now, and in the writing that you do, even before it gets to the editor, it's a little bit tighter.
Yeah. I'm totally confident in that. I hear myself as I'm writing, I hear my editor, with a pen, don't do that kind of thing. So definitely.
So it ends up being a good experience in both ways. Not only the fact that you have a cookbook now, but maybe your writing improves too.
Absolutely.
And we talked about the fact that it's a New York Times bestseller. What runs through your mind when you think back to tinkering with sourdough and creating your starter from the very beginning to where this journey has taken you. And this is kind of only the beginning, right? I mean, you're only about 10 years or so into it. This is only the start. You've got a lot of baking left.
Yeah. I was thinking about that this morning because I heard about the bestseller list last night when my editor and my team over there at the publisher called. And I was thinking, like, I was trying to remember back to when I created my sourdough starter, and I was like, I would have never, like, seriously never thought, first off, that I'd write a cookbook, next that it would be on the bestseller list, like, never, ever. So it's kind of unreal, like surreal, unreal. I don't know. It's just, last night it was kind of hard to sleep because I was just like, this is crazy. Like, this is so amazing. I was so happy.
Let's wrap up with some sourdough questions. What is the biggest mistake that you think novices make when they're just starting out or just trying to get into the world of sourdough?
I think there's two things that a lot of beginning bakers struggle with, and I myself struggle with the same things. The first one is paying attention to the temperature of the dough, your starter, and if you're making a pre-ferment. I think that's huge. Temperature has such an important role to play in fermentation. It dictates the schedule, the flavor. There's just a lot of components. So, always have that instant read thermometer ready to kind of poke your dough, and it gives you an idea for where your dough's headed. That's first and foremost. The second one is I find that a lot of home bakers tend to undermix their dough. So they are afraid that they might over strengthen the dough or, over mix it, even in like a KitchenAid mixer. And the reality is I think most home bakers kind of undermix their dough. So it's very hard, if not impossible, to mix your dough too much by hand. I mean, you'd have to be mixing for an hour, longer. So you're almost never going to over mix it. And so usually I like to say, mix a little longer, you'll get a taller loaf, and you'll probably get a nicer interior as well.
So every time that you're adding, like, after you auto lease, you're adding the levain, you're adding the salt to really, really go for it for even 7 to 8 minutes? Is that too long? Is that crazy?
No.
Or okay?
No, by hand, a 10-minute mix, depending on your mixing style, your kneading style, like that's totally acceptable. Yeah.
I mean, you got to be pretty strong to mix sourdough by hand for 10 minutes.
you don't. So it doesn't have to be like crazy aggressive. It can just be like folds in the bowl. But that's why part of the way I do my recipes is I do a mix of I do a blend of some mixing up front and some stretching and folding during bulk fermentation. Right.
Of course, that's widely important too. I'm going to ask a more specific sourdough question, but a lot of them you like to do stretch and folds, at least in terms of like the beginner sourdough or your weekly sourdough. I'm more of a coil fold guy myself. I don't know. I like the way it works. Do you think there's like there's a positive or negative to either one of them? Does it really matter which one you do?
Well, I think they're both great techniques, and the coil fold. I've always called it like a gentle stretch and fold because it's there's less like stretching up and pulling over. Right. They're both great. I use both actually. It depends on how the dough is. So if the dough's already pretty strong and it has enough strength, a coil fold or a gentle fold is more appropriate.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So what are you baking the most frequently in your own home? Is it a bread? Is it focaccia? I don't know. Like what is the thing that you go to with your family?
I love pizza. So I make pizza probably, I don't want to say once a week, but at least, once every other week. Mm-hmm. Focaccia is really high up there just because it's so easy and it's so darn delicious. I mean, you can't, you can throw anything on that and it's amazing. But then, for my kids, I'm always making like a sandwich loaf, a pan loaf of some kind because they want peanut butter and jelly for school. And I think they get kind of tired of like I don't, but they get tired of like the crunchy and crusty, like the large, loaves. So they want something soft. So my pan de mie is a great one. And for me personally, it's always a large, like super crunchy loaf because that's my favorite kind of bread to make. So I think I'm always kind of doing one of the above in a day.
So I wonder if the regular like sourdough loaf would get offended because I think it's incredible sandwich bread. But everything else is called like when you do it in the Pullman pan, that's like the sandwich bread. You know what I mean?
That's a good point. You're right. I think the hearth or the freeform loaf makes a better sandwich bread than
yeah, with some like turkey and cheese and some chipotle mayo.
Yes.
It's like that's what I had for lunch today. It's perfect. What is next for you, with the website? Is there another cookbook in the works? I mean, what do you want to accomplish next, Maurizio?
I'm definitely taking a cookbook break, so there's no cookbook in the works right now.
Another one's not coming out next year? I can't believe it.
No. Oh, boy. I think my next thing is I'm always going to publish to the website, new recipes there. But I'm working on some courses, so I run the membership in my website for people to join, and I'm putting out some courses for members. So it's going to be like comprehensive video courses and kind of like a behind the scenes look at, making bread, from my perspective. It's material that would be great on the website or on YouTube or something, but I think it's more like personal, kind of intimate in a way. So I think the membership is the place for that kind of thing.
That's so cool. And just last thing for you, doesn't have to be a sourdough baker, doesn't have to be a bread baker in any way, but do you have any advice to young creators out there that are just starting out and just trying to do what they really love and trying to make something out of it?
That's a great question. I think for me, probably the most important thing is consistency. So it's not consistency, where some people say like, oh, you have to post every week, or, you got to have a YouTube video every week. I actually don't think that is the most important thing. I think it's just that you're consistent enough that you're showing up for the people that are interested in what you're creating. So, whether it means, writing a recipe or, a blog post or a business article or whatever, like once a month or once a week, whatever speaks to your audience, I think makes sense. But I think showing up consistently is super important. And then, second to that, maybe it's even before that, but it ties in well with it. It's kind of like, try to imagine your audience, like who you're writing for, or who you recording podcasts for, or who you're doing videos for. And if you can, define your audience, I think you can better create not the content to suit them, but you can present the things you want to present in the right way to reach those people. And I think that's like the most important thing, is like reaching those people in the right way.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. Maurizio, this was such a thrill. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes with us. Best of luck with everything going forward. And everybody, please go get it. The Perfect Loaf Cookbook. It's out right now. New York Times bestseller. Thanks again, Maurizio.
Thanks for having me.